Catholic school in Kaduna. But Father Kuka and his friends failed to convert me when they had the chance. You know, they had me at the age of 8, you know, with all the nuns, but nothing happened. Anyways, so I think that what is required is to have a conversation from within traditions. And maybe in the course of this conversation, we'll be able to talk about my experience in dealing with these issues in Kano. And we also need to understand that the conversation has to be empathetic, because there are things, we have certain stereotypes. I came to this conversation with certain stereotypes, thinking people were too conservative, people were rejecting modern ideas, only to realize on talking to them that they had a point. You know, so a simple issue is we always talk about, why don't you keep your girls in school? Why do you marry them off at a young age and they have all these children? But we never ask, who was supposed to build the school? Where is the school? Where are the teachers? We have not provided the education, and we blame people for not educating their children. I think these are questions we can talk about.
Bishop Kuka, His Highness already took a swipe at you. And so my question still comes back to that same issue. I'm Catholic as well, and I know what the Catholic Church says about contraception and all of that. So how do we begin to have these types of conversations, knowing that we're now faced with real problems? What's the position of the church, and how are you beginning to think about these issues, even in your diocese that's also beginning to face some of these population challenges?
Thank you very much. Actually, he didn't take a swipe, and I really want to commend him for...
Can we get closer to the mic? Yeah.
He didn't take a swipe at the Catholic Church, and I really think that he's a worthy ambassador of the Catholic Church. And it's also, you know, it's one of the things that I think other religions need to learn. We take your children, we want them to be good human beings. It's your responsibility to form them to what they want to be. But I think on a more serious note, it's quite troubling, because I ask myself, why am I here? I'm not a Pentecostal pastor, I don't have a private jet. What am I doing with all these people with tons of money? I think the first question we need to ask is that, why is it that everything that provides an opportunity becomes a liability in Nigeria? How is it that a country that is so resource endowed with all the opportunities that are available to us, why do things turn into liabilities in Nigeria? And I don't think it's enough for us to speculate about what populations, how other nations have turned populations into something positive. It is that there must be something in the Nigerian water, you know, that makes it impossible for us to lack the capacity and the sense of understanding of even opportunities. So I think the first thing that the first point I would like to make, first of all, is to make this country sufficiently livable for the huge amount of manpower that we have out there, to have a sense of passion to come back to our country. But to answer your question on family planning, I was a priest here in 1982-83 in Abuja here. And when we brought one of our Reverend sisters, Sister Maxwini of blessed memory, she was doing what the Catholic Church calls natural family planning. And it's luckily for us, the Minister of Education, Dr. Chukwu, actually managed to incorporate it into the family planning program. And it is, I don't think that there is any disagreement either way as to what constitutes family planning. But I think, unfortunately for us, very often, as I say in Nigeria, we think in vernacular and we try to speak in English. So, I mean, the idea of family planning gets lost. But I think we must move from the point in which children were an investment as far as the poor people saw them. They needed more hands, you know, on the farm. But now times have changed. And I live in Sokoto. And I met a gentleman in Sokoto who is in his 70s. Married, 1 wife, 3 children. I had to ask him to come. He was the one who wanted to see me. And when I asked him, I said, are you a Fulani man? He said, yes. From Sokoto, yes. He said, how come you've got only 3 children? And he said to me in Hausa, that is, I got mixed up with Igbos. And I think he said to me, One of my children is a medical doctor. The second one is a pharmacist. The third one is doing a PhD. I feed better than all my neighbors who have 5 wives and 30 children. So I think really for me, it's a question of creating opportunities for us to be able to have this kind of conversation.
It's a distinction without a difference.
No, Pius.
Nehemiah is pointing at the 4.
Close to Father Kuka. I once offered him my daughter in marriage, but he is sworn to abstinence and celibacy.
His Highness, I think it's a good segue back to you to see, how can we unpack the root causes? First of all, what's driving the high population is high fertility. Then we've got, especially in northern Nigeria, where we have the problem with marrying off young Nigerian girls at a very early age. And we have all of the attendant issues where they begin to have children at a much younger age for much longer. What does Islam say about this? How can we begin to deal with these issues within the confines of Islamic law?
Okay, thank you very much. Let me first of all take a small step away and say that when we this population problem is perhaps the most important developmental challenge we have to face. If we don't have a demographic transition, we will never have an economic transition, and that is a fact. The second thing is we need to have a greater nuance in looking at population and demography, because Nigeria is one country, but it's many countries in many respects. Fertility rates in some parts of this country are like 8 child per woman. In other parts, they're 3. Okay, and it's extremely important to understand that. You also have huge variation in fertility rates determined by levels of education. So girls who have not completed secondary school tend to have, or women who did not have secondary education, tend to have more children on the average than those who have gone through secondary education. You also have variation around economic activity. So women who are employed or who are earning an income tend to have fewer children. So from this, we can begin to understand where the problem is coming from. We talk about a population growth of 3-point-something% in Nigeria. The reality is that most of that is coming from the northeast and the northwest. That's where we've got the largest number of people. It's where you have the highest fertility rates. It's where you have the highest number of girls who have not had an education, and it's also where you have the highest levels of poverty. So in addressing this for me, if you ask me what is the single most important mindset change we need to have to address population growth, it is to see the woman as a human being. As a human being like any other human being with rights to education, with rights to health care, with rights to protection against violence, with rights to protection against arbitrary divorce and abuse, with rights to earning an income. Now, it sounds very simple, but that is at the heart of the problem. So long as girls and women are seen as nothing but baby factories that are being produced so that they can be married and have children, and that is all they do, you're going to have this change. So from the perspective of Islamic law, what we tried to do in codification was to try to have a conversation where people understood that there are things that we interpret as tradition and think basically is Islam. And the great thing is that many Muslim countries have had reforms of family law. Look at Malaysia, look at Tunisia, look at Morocco, look at even Pakistan, look at Egypt. And we're able to talk to scholars and show them that Muslim jurists in other parts of the world have addressed these issues. Issues around at what age do you consummate marriage? What do you need for consent? And why do we have all this problem in the North? It's so cheap to marry anyway. You pay a small mahar bride price, you take a wife, her father buys you the bed, he buys you the chairs, and he's not obliged under Islam, so it's so cheap to get a wife. After so many years, she has children, you wake up one day and say, I divorce you. It's so easy to divorce her, and then you divorce her and chase her out of the house with the children and create poverty. There is no protection. Now, when we talk to citizens and treat population control as something people are supposed to do, we miss the point. It is not the responsibility of the woman to protect herself. somebody has to say, under Islamic law, if this woman has children, she has custody of the children, the husband has responsibility for maintenance. You provide her a house. If a man divorces his wife with 5 children, and the court says, I take away the house and give it to the wife, he will think twice about divorcing her. And that is, and that is her right under Islam. But the governments and the courts have not protected that right. The problems I deal with every day are problems of women who have devoted their lives to families, produced children, and are thrown out. And they go back to their poor fathers and then increase the dependency ratio. You sent your daughter to a man, she comes back with 5 children, and you are not responsible for 6 that you did not produce.
Excellent. His Excellency, so we understand the conversation so far, but I wonder if there is room for us to also talk about population control in the way, say, a China approached it. Yeah? And how would that resonate with the people at the state level? Now, I'm talking to you as chairman of Nigeria Governors Forum. Is that a conversation we should even attempt to have, or is it foreclosed ab initio?
Well, first of all, China that had that conversation and that had a law to back that up, 1 child per family,
yes.
It's not a democracy where the citizens have rights and they can determine what they want to do with themselves. And there is reproductive rights. What we can do, in my view, is encourage people by showing them a pathway that leads to concrete progress and one that leads to reversal. The Civil Rights Act, the Child Rights Act, is a law that is already existing in Nigeria. The challenge is to what extent do we, either at the state level or even at the federal level, enforce the provisions of the Child Rights Act, which really talks about access to education, compulsory attendance at school. So it's a mismatch. You have a Child Rights Act that says all children of school age must be in school. And if they're not, the parents have a lot of explaining to do. And yet you have 10 million children that are out of school.
So the question is, who's supposed to enforce that act? Who's responsible? Who should NESG hold responsible?
NESG should hold governors responsible, okay, and hold the federal government responsible as well. Education is on the concurrent list. And in Ekiti, for example, education is not only free, it is compulsory. And we actually punish people if we find your child on the street hawking.
So there are no childs on the streets of Ekiti?
You will not find children on the streets of Ekiti hawking.
Impressive.
Yeah.
A round of applause for that. I think it's quite impressive. Juliet, speaking on behalf of the private sector, there's some data we saw that says that, just about 2 million Nigerians or thereabout earn more than $10,000 a day. Those are some of the numbers I believe, you probably look at every day. What would you, as private sector trying to sell into this market, be looking to government to do to ensure that we have citizens who have the earning power to be able to live, quality lifestyles?
Thank you. I think, first of all, $10,000 a day.
Sorry, $10,000 per annum, sorry.
Okay. Exactly, yeah. So, yeah, a good question. There are many things. Again, it loops back to primary thing is about core skills, right? What skills do people have? How do people connect in a way in which they can create opportunities for themselves? And opportunities, one of the things I say, look, industrialized manufacturing is great. Big factories are great, but they're never going to be able to employ the number of people that we have today who are employable but not employed. So we need policies that create micro-industries or support micro-industries, micro-formation of capital that can deploy to small sectors. A very classic example, the people who sell on Jumia today, they're not necessarily the big, we have big manufacturers, of course, but a greater percentage of them, I would say almost 95%, are small people into fashion, producing beauty products, or producing all kinds of things. Those kinds of people, if you ask them, what kind of capital do you require to scale your business, to be able to employ the next 10 people? Then they're going to tell you just 1 million naira. So what kind of policies? I'll be looking for policies that can support that sort of smaller distributed manufacturing, smaller distributed, micro industries. And the ways to do it is to leverage the power of the internet. I can speak for that because that's what we do. I would say leverage the power of the marketplace. You have the millions of people who are unemployed today or underemployed is a marketplace of talent. How do we leverage that? How do we bring that talent, that resource, into a position where they can be gainfully employed into small sectors? That, for me, is primary. And there are 3 things I would recommend, if you allow me to just talk about them. Today, we talk about infrastructure. We always talk about roads, transport, network. The mobile phone is infrastructure. The mobile phone creates connectivity and is a very important asset that if government can look at how do you bring smartphones into the hands of people as cheap as possible, you create a gateway into development and you create a gateway into employing people and utilizing the assets that we have in that population growth. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We've got about 30 minutes left, and I want to spend all of this time talking solutions now, and solutions to specific challenges, and how it should be done, and who should do it. Let me start with Bishop Kuka, because I know this is something the Kuka Center spends a lot of time thinking about. 10.5 million children out of school. Thankfully, none of them in Ekiti State, but in some of the other states, yeah? I had to go there. What can the states do to ensure that we don't have kids out of school and that we then block the pipeline so that we don't grow those numbers anymore?
Professor Claude Ake, the late Professor Claude Ake, made a very provocative statement. And he said, look, we shouldn't be saying that Africa is not developing. Actually, the theory of development has never even been in the vocabulary in the first place. And I think that if you look at what we have, these so-called powers at the center and at the level of the states and local government, is producing a dysfunctionality that is not sustainable. Now, the things that Anama has said are predominant in southern Nigeria. The elephant in the room remains northern Nigeria. The emir is here. He's still fighting for his life. Let me put it that way. Because of the position that he has taken, and all of you sitting, that is literally become a matter to a particular cause because the things he's saying are not popular. There are governors who can make up their mind whether they are governors or whether they are imams or whatever. So people are going around building mosques, sending people to pilgrimages, and so on and so forth. And the question is, the money that comes from the center to our states, for example, whom is it meant for? So when you say that education is on the concurrent list, I worry that we are heading in a direction in which many of our states are largely providing opportunities for incubators of hatred to grow. Why do I say this? If you take northern Nigeria, and what you say of northern Nigeria, I can say of, let's say, the 12 core northern states, where there isn't a single Christian and a single woman that is in the state assembly, right across. There's no single woman who is a member of the state assembly. Women are lucky if they become commissioner for women affairs. Now, and the critical challenge for us is how do we manage diversity? And the problems we are facing and talking about population is because we've not figured out how do we manage diversity? How do we manage talent? When the federal government says that it doesn't have a voice in what happens in distant states where governors over time have taken license to behave rather irresponsibly in terms of issues of education. Because frankly, when I sit down, I have restless nights. We have very little, the Catholic population in Sokoto diocese, which is Kebbi, Zamfara, Katsina, and Sokoto itself. We are 107,000 square kilometers. I have 5 secondary schools. I have to rely on the little collection that I receive in my church to send children to school. And I'm running schools that, for example, in many of the schools, 60% of the children are Muslims. Now, can we have some kind of conversation with the state government? The answer is almost no. So the point I'm making is, I think that northern Nigeria is the big culprit in a lot of the things that are wrong with Nigeria. And I say this with all sense of responsibility. I come from northern Nigeria. But right now, for example, when I sit down to think that we have 23 ministers from northern Nigeria, all the northern states, and out of those 23 ministers, only 2 are Christians. Now, and I ask myself, how do you create a sense of belonging? How do we bring all these resources that we have together? What is happening in southern Nigeria is the result of missionary education that laid the foundation. And when we talk about the collaboration between church and state, people bring in religion. Now, our children in northern Nigeria are doing very well. They are coming first in Saudi Arabia in Quranic recitation. But I've never had the son of a minister who took first in Quranic recitation, because their children are all abroad. So really, I mean, we have a serious time bomb, and the difficulty we have is that what I see is like a man driving a trailer and trying to negotiate a roundabout. So, and you are not going to get rid of, put 10 million children in school overnight. It's not going to happen. The governors themselves, UBEB will tell you, the resources are there. The governors are not accessing the resources because they are not prepared to pay the counterpart funding.
Sure.
So for me, it's that the conversation has not even started, tragically.
His Highness, before you became Emir of Kano, you were a public intellectual. You're still an economist. Is there something we can draw from economic theories on how to solve this problem? Something around incentive structures that can be put in place to ensure we reduce fertility rates, we get the kids off the streets, and all the other attendant issues?
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick. I'd like to say that Father Kuka has raised a number of issues, but because they're not related to demography, I'm not going to, I think we'll have a conversation. But there's something he said about the need for collaboration, especially interfaith collaboration. And I'd like to give one example, and this is really where sometimes because of this focus on differences, we shoot ourselves in the foot. A few years ago, Father Kuka and myself and Cardinal Onayekon were in Italy. What's the name of the city? What's the name of that town? We're in Assisi for a conference of the Committee of St. Egidio. We met a Spanish gentleman who used to be the CEO of Telefonica and who set up a foundation called the Pro Futuro Foundation, which has developed technology using tablets to have STEM, which is being used to train children in rainforests in Bolivia and Mexico and give them the same kind of education that you would find on the streets of Madrid or City of London. We invited this gentleman to lunch. And he told me this was basically the Pope's idea. The Pope encouraged him to focus on, and I'll take a little time, but this is important because it tells you how sometimes in this country we don't move forward. And when he started, the Pope called him and said, when I said out-of-school children, I didn't just mean Catholic children or Christian children. I'm concerned about out-of-school children all over the world. So I said to him, if you're looking for out-of-school children, northern Nigeria is where you have maybe the largest number. Why don't you come and let's work? So I invited him, and we had a meeting right here in the Hilton with Father Kuka, Bishop Onayekon, and a number of governors from northern Nigeria. And we agreed to sign an MOU to work with this, to see how we can work with the state governors, to work with Pro Futuro Foundation, to bring in technology so that we can get education to these out of school, including now that they've done it in Arabic as well. So it's not, they have a number of, including Arabic. If you have Al-Majiri who studied Arabic, they can get STEM in Arabic. I think Father Kuka mentioned this project somewhere. The next thing I knew was that the Catholic Church was bringing in someone to turn Almajiris into Christians. And the entire conversation, which I started, which I brought in a meeting which I chaired, became a conversation about an attempt to Christianize Almajiria. And we still haven't gotten out of that. We've not made progress. So to that extent, I think getting blinded by these issues and not focusing on the reality, which is that these are human beings who need an education. And if you don't give them an education, they're a liability and a problem for us in the future gets in the way. And it's unfortunate, it's very cynical, because many of these conversations and misrepresentations are deliberate by people who would like to manipulate the system and keep people where they are. So, that's the first point. Now, the second point about having these conversations is, again, we need to move away from hope into reality. Kaede, His Excellency Governor Fayemi, to be formal, the executive governor of Ekiti State. Okay, Kaede, I think that's easier. So Kaede, okay, Bishop Kuka. So Kaede has just said, okay, that you need to educate the girl child. To be honest, I have always said, and anybody who knows me, the best contraceptive for the woman is education. Okay? You know, we have these NGOs coming to hospitals and trying to teach women how to use contraceptives when they're 25. It is too late. You know, when they're educated, they've already learned about sexual and reproductive health. They know how to take care of themselves. Okay, when they have a job, they know that they're not going to have a baby every year and take maternity leave every year. You leave it to them and they will sort themselves out. You don't need a law. If you really want to help deal with population growth and fertility rates, invest in educating the young girls. Now, we've said that, we always say that. I mean, my state government, thankfully, recently said we're going to have free compulsory education up to senior secondary school. Now, that is step number one. The next step is, how many children do you have? How many schools do you need? How many teachers do you need? How much will it cost? How much? This is the hard work that we have not done. We moved from hope and aspiration to reality everywhere in Nigeria. How much comes from the federal government? How much from the state? The World Bank, all these NGOs are telling us, educate the girl child, put your money where your mouth is, okay? If you can give us $2 billion to build airports and to build bridges, well, give us $2 billion, 40 years concessionary for girl child education. You know, until we actually begin to crunch the numbers and see where the money is going to come from, we'll not do it. The final thing is that it's not always about money. So Father Kuka mentioned something here. I'm not now talking about inclusiveness. When you talk about diversity, it's not just about political correctness. It's about what makes sense. Okay, if you come to Kano and you build 1,000 beautiful schools populated with male teachers, many people will not send their daughters to that school. That's the reality. You need to invest in women teachers. Traditional people want to send their teenage daughter to school where the principal, the vice principal, the head teacher, the majority are female. They're still not comfortable with co-educational institutions. Now, you can try to preach to them and tell them to accept co-education, or you can provide them with girls' schools so they can send their child. The British came to Kano and they built all girls' schools. And my grandfather's sisters, old women, are educated because they went to all girls' schools. If they had co-educational institutions, no princess at that time would have gone to school. Excellent. These are the kinds of things I think we need to look at.
Thank you very much. So everything seems to, be coalescing around education. And even beyond dealing with the population crisis we have, developing our economy and everything else. How are the governors thinking about education? How are they thinking about the infrastructure of education, the teachers, curriculum, etc.? We know it's on the concurrent list, but we know we're at a point now where we have a serious emergency, whether we declare it or not. How are the governors, who are also on the front lines of whatever it is that comes out of this whole mess, how are they thinking about this problem, or are they not?
Obviously, governors are thinking about this all the time. Education is front and center on the agenda of most governors that I know. Whether the capacity is there to deliver on their wish and on the promises they've made is a different matter. You talk about curriculum, for example. It's part of the invidiousness of our federalism that states are not in charge of curriculum. I mean, you can insert your own things, but curriculum is a national agenda. It is something that the National Council on Education agree on and then sell to the various components of the state. But I think, and it's not always something that responds to even the capacity gaps in the country. I mean, we used to have a national manpower board in those days. I think Pat Utomi was chairman of National Manpower Board at some point. But it no longer does that long-term perspective planning that can point to the future and say, okay, this is where we're going to have the next set of recruits, and this is what we must do in order to ensure that we convert, just as Ibukun outlined earlier, convert graduates of any field into that particular critical gap that we have. And I think that has to happen at the local level as well as at the national level. Part of the problem we also have, if you look at the way we reward states, for example, what we reward is population and land mass. The Nigerian Constitution rewards population. You're saying we shouldn't go for population, but if you are going to rise in the indices of the Revenue Mobilization and Fiscal Allocation Commission, you must have a big population. And it doesn't necessarily mean that what you get then gets to the population that you've collected the resources, on whose behalf you've collected the resources. So I think there are some things that are misshapen that we need to deal with. But in the immediate, we have a human capital agenda at the level of the governors, at the Governors Forum, and at the level of the National Economic Council, which is looking at two triggers, health and education, and looking at basic education. The point that His Highness just made about compulsory girl-child education up to senior secondary school is what has been adopted across the board by all governors. How they deliver it again.
Which is the next question I have for you.
It's the next question. Father Kuka, Bishop Kuka, talked about states not collecting UBEC funding because of the challenges with counterpart funding. In the first instance, the whole notion of UBEC funding is a problematic one that we need to address, because for states, you cannot micromanage education at the level of the states. That's what UBEC seeks to do. UBEC wants to even design schools, tell you the books you must buy, and the publisher you must approach. Those are not things.
So if these are constraints, right, if these are big issues, because we have to deal with it at the federal level.
These are big issues that are being dealt with.
Are there pragmatic workarounds? Is there a way we can navigate, as Doyin Salami would say, what the problem we have is?
There are pragmatic workarounds.
Yeah.
I mean, over the last 1 year, most states have cleared their outstanding counterpart funding from UBEC. It's not true that states are not collecting. I don't know many states. Maybe they have 1 year left. And this we were able to achieve via the creative arrangement of utilizing the Paris Club refunds to the state to settle outstanding UBEC obligations. So virtually every single state that I know has accessed what they're entitled to from UBEC. What they're doing with the resources on the ground, and I believe a lot of them are doing a lot with it, but is it enough? Excellent. Even when you spend everything that comes from UBEC.
Let me go to His Highness. I'll come back to you, Juliet.
Thank you very much, Patrick. You know, now that we have the governor, I think we need to talk about this very clearly. We are never going to fix our educational problems by doing the same thing we're doing, even if we do it more intensively. We've got to completely think outside the box, because that's not worked. Now, there are a number of issues. Given the number of children you want to educate, and the number of children that are waiting to go into school, there isn't enough money in Nigeria to build enough schools, concrete and mortar, employ enough teachers to do this, our normal classroom. So this whole idea of education being in a built school has to go, okay? Education is about delivering learning, okay? I've said that in Kano, for example. You go to a local government, you have 40 mosques, and you have one school. If you have 40 mosques, you have 40 schools. Sit down in the mosque and learn when you're not praying. Okay, so that's one. Okay, you've got to churches. I mean, sit down, go there. I mean, these churches, these monasteries, education started in religious institutions. The Al-Azhar University started in a mosque. In Fez, in Morocco, the mosque is the university. So there's no reason why all these buildings cannot be schools. Everybody, a house can be a school. That's one. The second thing is, we've got to interrogate the colonial legacies that we have had for 59 years that have not changed. One is restricting all education to the English language. Because we talk about population, now we're talking about controlling fertility rates, okay? That deals with this problem in the next 20, 30 years. But the ones that have been born are here. Mm-hmm. You can't kill them. You still have to deal with them, okay? Now, if you have people in a village in Kano and you want to teach them agriculture or poultry, or somebody talk about nursing. People you want to be a nurse or a midwife, you have to study English. Do you speak English to the baby and tell the baby to come out? Why can't you, why don't we encourage why can you be a medical doctor studying in Chinese or in French or in German, but not in Yoruba or Hausa or Igbo? Why? Okay, why? The emphasis on English, learning English first, has created distance between us and the rapid ramp-up of education. There is no reason why we cannot encourage the transmission of important knowledge in indigenous languages, and that goes to the curriculum. The third is technology. There's enough technology going around in the world now that tells us how by if the government invests in the infrastructure and the bandwidth, for example, in the power, the private sector can make all the investments that you need to use technology to deliver education to people. Right. So for me, the idea is you have to stop thinking we need more money to ramp up what we're doing and just say, why don't we just stop what we're doing and do something very different?
Thank you very much. Juliet?
I just wanted to add to what His Royal Highness has mentioned in terms of the technology part of it. I mentioned earlier how a mobile phone is part of infrastructure. And why I was saying that is because with a mobile phone, a simple smartphone, you can actually deliver learning. Even with students who are not in any specific building, whether it's a mosque, a church, or a school, you can deliver learning, you can do standardized testing, all of that is possible. Of course, again, with broadband access, making sure that people, wherever they have access to internet. In fact, there are three things, I was talking about three things which I would say are core infrastructure in addition to transport infrastructure. The first one I mentioned is mobile phone. The second one is broadband. The third one I would say is identity management. I think one of the critical things which we really need to be able to deliver sustainable development is making sure that we have every single person has an ID. The person can be traceable, we can understand what their requirements are, what their needs are, and we can then be able to make useful analysis to decide where do we deliver different types of development.
We're getting into the last stretch, and I'd like us to begin to wrap it up. I'll go to Bishop Kuka. I don't make the mistake of calling you Father Kuka. So my question is around incentives. Yeah. How can we use incentives to drive some of the behavioral changes we desire to see? So a man who needs the kids in the farm will definitely take them to the farm because there's an economic incentive for him to do that. Is there a way government, federal, state, local, can create a different incentive structure that allows for this man to weigh his options and say it's better for me to put the kid in school, or it will cost me more if the kid is not in school? I wonder if you've got some thoughts on that, especially as it relates to northern Nigeria.
I think you economists talk about incentive compatibility. I think the first thing to say is that there's too much politics in the land. Everything wraps around politics. And sadly, our people have become thoroughly cynical of politics and the capacity of politicians to deliver. This is not as a result of the absence of decent men and women who are working very hard. But there is need to reverse that conversation so that people can have greater trust in institutions, whether they're politicians, whether they're churches. I worry so much about in this country. I'm a priest of the Catholic Church, but I worry about the volume and amount of religion that is occupying the public space. Suddenly now, I just saw this morning that Boko Haram now is no longer a military operation. Maybe that exaggerates it, but I see that the government of Borno has a contract with 30 imams from Saudi Arabia to pray away Boko Haram. Now, I worry because, well, ordinarily I should rejoice because we should get part of, a piece of the action. But I think this is very serious because it talks to us about where we are and how we see our problems. So I think that if you're talking about incentives, the incentives will have to be much more clearly thought out. We'll have to think a bit more clearly about what it is to get a job, because too many people are getting educated, they're getting certificates, but they are still piling behind their brothers and sisters who graduated 3-4 years ago. So there needs to be an entire conversation about how people can make use of the skills that they have. And I think it speaks to what the Emir is saying.
His Highness, a minute and a half.
Okay, I'd like to say 3 things. One, I'll give an example of an incentive, and I'm not saying it's something that can work here, but just to give you an idea of how some countries have thought through this imaginatively. So Egypt, for example, wants to discourage people from having too many children. The Egyptian government says, if you have only one child, the government will pay for that child's education up to university. If you have 2 children, you pay for them, okay? If you are on welfare, you cannot have more than 2 children. If you have more than 2 children, you don't need welfare. Now, it doesn't force anybody not to have, but if you want to have state welfare, if you're poor, and this is about really helping people who do not have the means from imposing upon themselves burdens that they cannot take.
Correct.
In northern Nigeria, you have somebody who finds it difficult to maintain one wife. And he harvests his crops, sees a young girl, marries a second wife, marries a third wife, produces 20 children, leaves them on the street begging. Okay, because he knows the society will take care of it. Now, one of the incentive systems is a negative incentive. If you see, if a man has a child, you impose upon him the burden of maintaining that child legally and make him responsible for it. If your child is found on the street, it's not the child's fault. You hold the father responsible, and it should be an offense for which you can go to jail, leaving your child roaming the streets. So that, that is the kind of incentive system. The other thing I mentioned, okay, divorce. Divorce is so cheap. You have to create the conditions that make it difficult to exit a marriage. If you can't stop a man from divorcing his wife, at least make sure that when he divorces her, the financial responsibility does not end. And when you realize that you don't divorce your wife and then free yourself of financial burdens, you're then more committed to keeping them. That's the second one. Now, the third and final one it goes back to what I said about women. One of the reasons we have extreme poverty in the north is the very high dependency ratio. But it does not have to be like that. Now, you just mentioned agriculture and education. Now, for you, it is either or. Why can't it be both? Why can't a child have an education and work on the farm? When you take them away from the farm and take them to school, then they come out and they look down on agriculture. So you have a graduate BSc agriculture, he's coming with a CV, he wants to work in the central bank. Why? He should go and build an agricultural enterprise. So being on the farm is itself an education. If you invest in that and see that as a future for the young person as an entrepreneur in agriculture. So these are the kinds of things I think we need to look at.
Thank you very much. And I know it was not intended to take a swipe at me because I have a bachelor's in agriculture. I tried to, but it didn't work. Governor Fayemi, final thoughts?
Well, I have a duty to defend, protect, and support governors. So, and I think I need to respond to Bishop Kuka on what's happening in Borno. I know the great work that Governor Zulum is doing in that state. I don't think the way this whole religious angle has been introduced as a solution to the crisis of insurgency is an accurate one. There may be people who are pushing that, but I think that there are multi-level issues that are being dealt with. But it's also not something that can be exclusively done at the state level. Protecting the citizens, particularly against external aggression of some sort, is a federal responsibility, but the state is playing its role there. That's just an aside, Bishop. But on incentives, I think incentives have to be both ways. We also have to incentivize those who are in charge of policy making and implementation to see this as something they should focus on, rather than something to be penalized for. Yeah. Generally, you get more kudos, sadly, in Nigeria, from the Nigerian public, when you build roads and you build huge infrastructure than when you pay teachers and build schools and do things that are seen to be intangible in the eyes of the people. So we need to reorder our priorities and make it something to encourage those who are in charge to really focus their attention on.
And you're not speaking from experience, are you?
Well...
Juliet, final thoughts?
I think I would just add on to what had been mentioned earlier. When you talk about incentives, I look at it from a private sector perspective. I look at it at how you make it systemic. And for me, a very systemic way in which we can look at it is, today you look at education and there's no clear linkage between education and job creation. A lot of people come out and they have no jobs. Like you said, someone who reads agriculture is trying to find a job in the central bank. So if we go back to the state level and states are able to document very clearly, given the capacity of what is existing in that state, the resources that are available, the opportunities that exist in that state, what are the kinds of skill sets that are required? And then that feeds back into the education. So a state, for example, says, for the next 10 years, some countries have done it. For the next 10 years, for the next 20 years, what we need the most are 1, cybersecurity, 2, computer programming, 3 is this, list all those kinds of skill sets. And so be it if it is agriculture for a state. Then they know that as they are investing in education, that they expect those people to stay back in those communities and be able to actually find solutions that are relevant for that environment, relevant for the farms, or relevant for healthcare, or for education, or for other kinds of industries that exist in that state. If you create those kinds of linkages, you have a systemic incentive system in place.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry about this.
30 seconds.
Okay, this is something that I'd wanted to mention. The people in this room are part of the problem. Okay? If there's one thing that this country has failed in the last 20, 30 years, it is that we have created an environment for the death of the public intellectual. The people in this room who are educated, who are wealthy, who have the ability to speak up, would rather sit down quietly and allow others without a national conversation around issues, around women, around rights, around children. We are not going to move forward. And the only way, what Kayode is saying now, the only way you can get people to appreciate a governor who invests in education is that there is a narrative out there that says education is more important than the bridge. Yeah. And it is the people in this room who are responsible for that silence.
Thank you very much. A round of applause for the panel. Population growth could be an asset or a liability, depends on the choices we make, the policy choices that we make as a government and as a people, and we look to NESG to continue the job it's doing, to keep pushing this narrative and keep pushing government to make the right decisions. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience. Thank you.
On the 13th.
Invite the chairman and the CEO to please join them here for a group photograph very quickly before we break for the design workshops. Thank you very much. And so in your program, we have the venues for the design workshops, but that will be after lunch upstairs. That will be after lunch upstairs.